Thank you all for coming to the first CECA-sponsored creative writing event of the semester. Although you can't see each other, there are 94 people registered, and keep an eye out for our events calendar for future virtual programming. Our next creative writer will be young adult author Bill Konigsberg on October the 14th. We at Austin Peay feel fortunate to host the only Center of Excellence for the Creative Arts in the state of Tennessee, which supports Zone 3 Press. We publish one book annually through our first book award for poetry and our Creative Nonfiction Book Award, which we celebrate tonight by bringing together our recent winner, Sarah Kasbeer, with Alice Bolin, the judge who selected her book, A Woman, a Man, An Outline of a Plan. And I have advanced copies here. I invited Alice Bolin to judge our 2019 contest because I was inspired by her awareness of the way American society glorifies danger to women. 4 years before the Me Too movement began, she published an essay in the Los Angeles Review of Books that went viral. The Oldest Story, Toward a Theory of a Dead Girl Show, relays a macabre Western fascination with women who are abused or killed. In the essay, she traces a long tradition from fairy tales to television series like True Detective, Pretty Little Liars, and Twin Peaks. These stories, Bolin explains, are warped inversions of the hero's quest, which is, quote, not about a journey instigated by a dead girl body toward existential knowledge, but the mess, the calamity, and the obscurity that are the consequences of misogyny, end quote. This essay serves as the lodestar for Bolin's debut essay collection, Dead Girls, published by Morrow HarperCollins in 2018. Her book examines injustices perpetuated by the stories we tell and consume about power and romance, femininity, and wounds. I trusted such a voice to find our next Zone 3 author and to evolve our press mission to promote aesthetic diversity and content of consequence. I'll post a link to the press website in the chat for those who want to purchase either of these books. Sarah will read after Alice, and after the reading, both authors will answer your questions submitted through the Q&A. Alice Bolin's nonfiction has appeared in a number of respected publications, such as Elle, Salon, the Paris Review, and the New Yorker. She currently teaches creative nonfiction at the University of Memphis. Please welcome Alice Bolin.
Thank you, Amy and Sarah. This is so amazing to be here to celebrate Sarah's book. And yeah, I will talk a little more about it later, but I love it. And so I will only give a very short reading. I'm the opening act, and that's great. So when I read from my book, I usually say, does anybody like Britney Spears? Because this essay that I have about Britney Spears is kind of the most readable one, and it's the one that has the least murder in it. So I'm just gonna read some of this piece. So this is Lonely Heart. I wanna be able to see my clock. There we go. A few years ago, my friend Paul posted on Twitter, "When you finally get the Britney Spears song, Hit Me Baby One More Time," like 15 years after hearing it for the first time. This had been on my mind too, how Baby One More Time had started to strike me as very deep and very sad. Spears' first single is comfortably one of the most important pop songs of all time. The song and its iconic music video featuring 16-year-old Spears in a Catholic school uniform dancing provocatively through a high school's hallways rang in the teen pop craze of the late 90s and early aughts, when a generation of Spears' fellow former Disney Channel stars busted out of Orlando and went a little wild. Sorry. I think most people grant that Baby One More Time is a good song. Its production is visceral. The opening piano chords that summon pop spirits, the wah-wah guitars, the cymbal crashes, and the use of background vocals are all distinctive. And this was the first showcase for Spears' singing voice, which is sexy, abrasive, and strange. Baby One More Time has all the features of an incredible late-era pop single. Simple hooks over tightly layered production, designed to move your mood, not your mind. Why is it anything more than that? Spears has had 24 major hits since Baby One More Time was released in 1998, and her singles Stronger, Oops, I Did It Again, and You Drive Me Crazy are all remarkably similar to Baby One More Time. Still, her first song remains her greatest hit. Baby One More Time doesn't just tower over her other singles because it was the first, or because she tied up her school uniform shirt in the music video. Paul tweeted, "My loneliness is killing me. Britney Spears." She sings this over and over, so why had I never heard it? I was an actual Catholic schoolgirl at the age of 16, and I was so dismally far from the music video fantasy. The Catholic high school I went to for a semester in Nebraska was underfunded and strange. At the end of the school year, we had to hot glue our textbooks back together. From what I could tell, the school's prime objective was to instruct students not to have abortions or vote for John Kerry. I jumped ship the first week of my senior year. I decided to get my GED, which, if you've been to the majority of high school, is, as my GED counselor told me, a moot point. But because I was under 18, regulations put forth by the state of Nebraska to dissuade people from dropping out of high school dictated that I had to take 10 hours of GED training at the local community college. I finished all of the preparatory materials before my 10 hours were up, so the teacher running their training sessions let me put my head down on my desk. In the same obstructive spirit that required training hours, I was told I could not actually receive my GED certificate until I was 18. However, they gave me a letter that served as notice that I had passed the exam. At 16, I sent the University of Nebraska my GED letter and an essay I wrote about a book I hadn't read, and they let me into the honors program. The most prominent part of Spears's personal brand has always been that she is like a virgin, vacillating absolutely and consistently between performing as an adolescent girl and a sexually mature woman. Part of her little girl act is pretending not to understand the sexual attention she elicits. "All I do is tie up my shirt," she told Rolling Stone about the Baby One More Time video. And yet Spears has been remarkably self-aware, even calculating about the conflicts in her persona. Her hit "I'm Not a Girl, Not Yet a Woman" from her coming-of-age movie Crossroads is the most blatant expression of this trope. Or maybe it's the "Oops, I Did It Again" video, where 18-year-old Spears dances in a skin-tight red leather bodysuit and sings, "I'm Not That Innocent." In Overprotected, released 10 days after Spears' 20th birthday, she makes several startling complaints. "I tell them what I like, what I want, what I don't," she sings, "but every time I do, I stand corrected." She's singing not as a post-adolescent coming into her own, but as a woman who's been guarded and controlled by handlers since she was 15. She is self-aware in performing not only the naughty schoolgirl, but also the anonymous superstar, her body a projection screen that all of the world's desires can flicker across. Her early hit "Lucky" is an unsubtle allegory about a starlet named Lucky who dreams of escaping fame. How perverse that Martin would write this song for Spears and her managers would agree that she should record it, then release it as a single and profit off of it. "She's so lucky," Spears sings. "She's a star, but she cries in her lonely heart." When we confront it, this sadness is so much more dissonant than the sex in her videos. "My loneliness is killing me. My loneliness is killing me." There's a little bit more about me here, but I'm going to skip it. Sorry. Is pop music smart? It is easy to attribute the brilliance of Baby One More Time to the familiar accident where a whole is greater than the sum of its parts. We can draw up a diagram of the contributing factors for its success. Max Martin, Jive Records, trends in top 40 radio, Debbie Gibson, Monica Lewinsky, the Disney Channel, and, very last, Spears herself. It goes back to capitalism's odd vision of the market, which knows everything but is not intelligent by the same standard we would judge life on other planets. But to my mind, Baby One More Time speaks as keenly about the loneliness of love as any other artifact of our culture. It's not about losing someone, but the impossibility of ever really having them. When I'm not with you, I lose my mind, Spears sings. Romantic love doesn't lessen the opacity of other people's thoughts and motivations. It heightens it because the desire to know and inhabit the beloved's mind is so great. That's what makes us sick in love, crazy in love. Short experiences of union reinforce that each of us is, once and for all, a single person alone in a body known only to the self. I'm not reading too much into the song. Pop music can speak deep truths because it is simple, because the truest truths are simple. What isn't simple is a 16-year-old in her expected setting, a high school, singing about grown-up desperation. Or an artist whose greatest creative preoccupation seems to be a smiling sadomasochism, hit me baby and vinyl bodysuits, the giant snake on her shoulders as she sang, I'm a slave for you, being labeled as America's sweetheart. Or a woman hunted by paparazzi who photographed her working out, going to Starbucks, driving recklessly with her son on her lap, shaving her head, who photographed her genitals as she got out of her limo for an audience that loved her almost to death. I guess I can't see the harm in working and being a mama, Spears sang in 2007, just after her series of personal crises with her signature false naivete. Britney Spears' music is about desire. From the beginning, Britney Spears herself has been about a prodigious contradiction, a prodigious loneliness. Watch the end of the Baby One More Time video as Spears holds her face with boredoms and smirks at the camera, her pigtail braids secured with feather scrunchies, and witness the spark. It's not the dumb hand of the market patting her head with approval, nor sex and its dumb compulsions, nor even the dumb intelligence that is satire or critique. It's that other thing, art. Okay, that's it. I will just introduce Sarah now, I think. I think we're at that point.
Sounds good.
Okay. It's so funny doing these events where there's no feedback from the audience and you're just like, okay, next up.
That was excellent. It was excellent.
So I don't need feedback. I just it's about the rhythm of the event. So I'm super excited to introduce Sarah Kasbeer. Am I saying your name correctly, Sarah?
It's Kasbeer, but I'll take it.
Kasbeer. Okay, got it. When I read the first essay in her book, which has an amazing cover, by the way, is this going to be the final cover?
It will have a blurb across the top, I believe.
Cool, but it'll look like this.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it so much. So I was immediately struck by this book, and I kind of knew, like, oh, I want to keep reading this. But it didn't go in all the places that I intended. I mean, that I imagined that it might, and in a good way. It did surprise me. I have a little blurb here that I've written, not the same blurb that will be on the book, or somewhere, but I do want to say a little bit about how it struck me when I first read this book. So, a woman, a man, and the outline of a plan a plan and the outline of a man, which I wrote incorrectly, immediately evoked the contradictions of Midwestern girlhood in vivid cinematic scenes that recall geniuses including Joanne Beard, Charles Portis, and Eileen Miles, three of my favorite writers. So you're off to a good start. These are essays painted in full detail. So when I talk to my students, I tell them to use uncanny details, which is what I think of as sort of this marriage of like the beautiful and strange, and kind of like what makes nonfiction stranger than fiction. And this book is just full of them, just brimming with them. And American archetypes like the teenage good girl with a jailbird boyfriend. Everything about these essays is American, particularly their humor, beauty, and laconic brutality. But what I really appreciate about this book is that Kasbeer is not only interested in the explosion, but also the aftermath. We learn how to create a woman out of a broken girl, with healing coming from unexpected sources, including one very special elephant and an unforgettable pair of dog puppets. So I'll read Sarah's bio, but that's what I wanted to say about how the book struck me when I first read it. And it really is a huge honor to be here and to just have any part in bringing this book into the world. So congratulations, Sarah. But Sarah Kasbeer is an essayist and fiction writer living in New York City. Her work has appeared in Creative Nonfiction, Dissent, Elle, Guernica, the New York Magazine, why can't I say that, and many other places. A Woman, A Plan, and the Outline of a Man is her first book. So join me in welcoming Sarah.
Wow, I'm so honored to be here. Thank you to APSU and Zone 3 Press for having me, and big thank you to Alice for selecting my manuscript. It's really an honor and I'm thrilled. I'm also really happy that you read that Britney Spears essay, because a lot of what I wrote about in my book was how I understood femininity and sexuality as a teenager versus how I understand it now as a 36-year-old, which is how old I was when I wrote it. And I thought a lot about Britney Spears, whose image was influenced many young girls. And then here 20 years later, we find out actually all of these women we saw were sort of manufactured by men. That's how their identities came to be. So that was a very salient essay. So thank you for that. I am going to read from my book, A Woman, A Plan, An Outline of a Man. It is about my formative experiences with men loosely, and particularly the traumatic ones, because I just think that's a big part of growing up female. I would like to read the first essay, which is about my first boyfriend. It's called On the Edge of 17. Tammy drove a black pickup, smaller than her son Jack's blue one, which sat idly in their driveway for the 4.5 months he spent doing time for, quote, some mob action shit. That's what he'd called it when I asked him why he had to go to court. He'd assured me, his girlfriend of just a few months, that the whole group aggravated battery thing was a simple matter of wrong place, wrong time, as if the cops had only pinned something on him because of his previous record. When we'd met the summer before, he seemed like a regular, appealingly dangerous 17-year-old boy. On a Saturday in the spring of my junior year in high school, I accompanied Tammy on the 1.5-hour drive up to the prison where Jack was being held. He would be there until a spot opened up in boot camp, a military-style training program, also known as shock incarceration, intended to shorten sentences for non-serial offenders. Tammy and I had gone to the mall the weekend before, where she handed me a $100 bill to buy Jack an all-white pair of Nikes that would pass the boot camp's regulations. When the sales associate at Finish Line tried to show me other options and I explained why I needed the all-white ones, his eyes bulged as if they were trying to escape his head, and he turned to get me the size 13s. Tammy and I smoked cigarettes all the way to Joliet Correctional Facility, which has since been shuttered and used as the fictional Fox River Prison on television. When I watched the show Prison Break years later, I couldn't figure out why the medieval-style limestone building, complete with turrets, was so triggering. I'd conveniently forgotten the time I was a visitor. As we approached the barbed wire fence, I asked Tammy what kinds of criminals were locked up inside. They got murderers and rapists, she said, pulling over to dump the joint roaches out of her ashtray. All kinds of shit. I noticed that, along with the Nikes, she'd brought a brown paper bag full of magazines and peeked through them when we stopped for gas. Some were about cars, but most were pornography. Naked blonde women with their legs spread open, sprawled out on top of cars or squatting next to motorcycles. Once we got inside, past the metal detector, I heard whistles and cat calls. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead. It had been difficult to choose an outfit that morning. I wanted to look sexy for my prison boyfriend, but hadn't fully considered the murderers and the rapists. Suddenly, I was hyper aware of my cleavage, showcased by the neckline of my favorite nautical navy blue spandex camisole. I zipped up my jacket. When we entered the small, plain visitation room, furnished with a few 4-seat tables and vending machines, Jack was already there, waiting. He was wearing what could have been hospital scrubs, if you ignored the numbers across the back, and he looked pale, like he'd just seen his first spleen, his green eyes vivid against the sallow backdrop of his skin. I hugged his 6'3" frame as Tammy went to buy us snacks from the vending machine. Except for that initial greeting, we weren't allowed to touch at all. He seemed shaken by his new surroundings, but not afraid. I knew I didn't have to worry about him, but something in me shifted when I saw he couldn't be the protective, affectionate boyfriend I had fallen for in the first place. 20 years later, our short visit is a blur. More memorable is the joint Tammy and I shared on the way home. After seeing her 220-pound adult baby in prison, she was uncharacteristically silent. Typically, she would ramble on about her boyfriend or her neighbors who were always doing something that bugged her. "That's 8 up," she'd quip, her shaggy bleach blonde hair pulled half up and held in place with a scrunchie, her long bangs swaying back and forth as she shook her head. With Jack temporarily out of the picture, I was spending more time with Tammy. I'd come over and she'd sit in a rocking chair, yakking on about nonsense, and every so often getting up to look out the window as if something important or threatening might be happening out there. "I hear that," I'd respond after almost everything she said, waiting for her to catch on that I had no clue what she was talking about. She never did. Unlike my own mother, who criticized how I dressed and acted, Tammy couldn't have cared less how I presented myself. Her overly tan face was covered in wrinkles, though she couldn't have been more than 40. She wore crop tops that revealed a leathery stomach and a belly button that sank into her petite frame like the mouth of a rotting pumpkin during an unseasonably warm October. My hometown is an unremarkable stop off Interstate 55, which cuts a path between Chicago and St. Louis, through soybean and cornfields. Not only was there nothing to do there growing up, but there was no nearby city that felt worth aspiring to. And before the internet, no real connection to the outside world. I was sheltered, unaware that the privileges I enjoyed as a member of the upper middle class were not universal. My parents were quite strict, and in response, I became rebellious. Every one of their actions had an equal and opposite reaction. They grounded me for drinking, I snuck out. They threw away my cigarettes, I pulled them out of the trash. They flushed my weed, I stole 20s from my father's wallet to replace it. This went on until I somehow broke them. They gave up and we mostly stopped speaking. But they let me keep driving their Honda as long as I kept my grades up and got a job every summer. At 16, I worked as a lifeguard at a public park, collecting cash for paddle boat rentals and ensuring patrons were equipped with life jackets. Because I was a pothead, I skimmed off the paddle boat operation to order myself deliveries, which came in through a chain link fence behind the shed where I was stationed. When my weed dealer told me about a party on the college campus in my town, I went. There, I met 17-year-old Jack. Almost 2 years older than me, he was ruggedly handsome in a white V-neck t-shirt and jeans. He didn't say much, but somehow managed to command the kind of respect normally reserved for star athletes or mob bosses. I noticed our hair was the same color, light brown with highlights. I later learned he'd put a garbage bag on his head, poked holes in it, and bleached whatever bits of hair he could pull through. The appropriate terminology for the result, popular in 1998, was frosted tips. I bleached my hair yellow straight from a bottle, since my mother wouldn't pay for me to have it done professionally. At the party, the boys drank beer in the flatbed of Jack's blue pickup. Jack looked at me intently, his green eyes picking up on my insecurity. "You're pretty," he said, lighting my cigarette. I noticed a fresh scar on his hand, and he told me he had just gotten out of jail. He explained he'd gotten drunk and punched through a front door window, the cause of both the scar and of his arrest. He was unconcerned with sports, popularity, and high school society in general, things I also hated, but for different reasons. I was too rebellious for the nerds, too smart for the jocks, and not into drama class. I didn't fit in anywhere, so I smoked pot constantly to temper my social anxiety. He drank heavily, gambled over cards at his mom's trailer, and rode shotgun in my car while eating pork rinds, a snack I hadn't even known existed. After Jack got locked up, I found a lone pork rind between the passenger seat and the door and cried. By the fall of my junior year, Jack and I had become a couple, and he took me to homecoming. We doubled with my best friend Alex and her boyfriend, the star of the football team. Jack seemed uncomfortable when he showed up at my parents' house, a white brick 4-bedroom with blue shutters, in dress slacks and a button-up shirt. I wore a royal blue satin dress. My parents took photos of us before we went to the only fancy hotel restaurant in town to get burgers. After dinner, while traveling to the dance in the football star's Jeep, the air thick with the scent of our rose corsages, another driver motioned angrily at us for cutting him off. Jack rolled down his window, made a deep Marlboro red infused gurgle, and launched the largest loogie I'd ever seen. It sailed over the lane marker directly onto the other driver's side window. The man, in his mid-30s, likely, and wearing glasses, looked back at us from behind the yellow slime, horrified. We all hesitated before breaking into laughter. I was making a habit of skipping school to hang out with Tammy, chiming in on her rants just so I had someone amusing to get stoned with. Jack didn't smoke pot, and his relationship with his mom consisted of good-natured ribbing, although sometimes Tammy would get fed up with his antics and let out her equivalent of a sigh, a long, deep, exaggerated, "Jesus." She was the kind of mother who, at the time, seemed novel, less like a parent and more like a cool older sister, which meant she let us have sex at her place. That November, I got pregnant. I didn't bother to tell Tammy and hid it from my own parents, along with the abortion I quickly decided to have. Jack drove me almost 2 hours away to the nearest clinic in Illinois, where protesters carried signs about killing babies and screamed at the car as we entered the parking lot. "Bunch of assholes," Jack said. He walked me inside, and once my name was called, waited in the parking lot. When I came back out dazed, the sunlight burning my eyes, I spotted the smoke from his Marlboros rising up from the sunroof of my teal 95 Honda Accord. I felt sick, but not sad. Just a few weeks later, though, Jack committed the crime that would send him to Fox River, his, quote, mob action shit, and the following month he received his 5-month sentence. Once he was gone, I'd go over to Tammy's house on Sunday nights and talk to Jack, who could call collect only once a week. Sometimes I'd get to answer the phone and hear the recording. "You have a collect call from," he'd say his full name, "at Joliet Correctional Facility." He also sent letters to my home address, which my mother collected and read, before eventually handing them over in a screening process that seemed to me at least as strict as the prisons. "I don't know why I'm letting you have these," she sighed, raising an eyebrow. "Some interesting illustrations in there." She had not expected to find teddy bears drawn by a convicted felon on an envelope addressed to her teenage daughter. I thought they expressed his soft interior, hidden from the rest of the world, but accessible to me. The lines had been traced over so many times that the pen had nearly punctured the paper, the same ink, I later learned, he'd also used to give himself a prison tat, a small blue mark at the base of his thumb. Happy to have proof he'd been thinking about me, I looked past his misspelled declarations of love and toward the promises he made about getting his life straightened out. He became my first long-distance boyfriend. At 17, the relationship that existed within the confines of my own head satisfied teenage societal pressures to have a significant other, as well as my penchant for melodrama. I loved someone, and we'd been torn apart by a force greater than my parents. All of this made me believe in starry-eyed things like destiny and romance, when in reality, Jack and I didn't know each other all that well. We'd only been together for 6 months and hadn't even had a real fight. With Jack gone, I was free to hang out every night at the apartment the boys in the graduating class above me had rented for the summer, or the APT as we called it. My friends and I would go there and smoke weed in an outdoor stairwell overlooking the train tracks, talk about the Blair Witch Project and shriek, while the boys sat there squinting, red-eyed from smoking. I found myself attracted to one of them and ended up going home with him. We agreed that no one should know, and especially not Jack. When I went to his house, I would park in a lot down the street, and he would look both ways out the front door before letting me in. But I couldn't help myself and eventually confessed the affair to a friend who predictably told Jack's ex-girlfriend. If I had learned anything from watching hours of Jerry Springer after school, it should have been to keep my fool mouth shut. When I Google Jack today, I find on the first page of the search results, his MySpace page, a 2005 mugshot from when he was charged with resisting arrest while on parole, shortly after getting out of prison following another sentence years after I knew him, and a court document referencing an abusive relationship. In a publicly available database, I also find records of at least 20 criminal charges, 9 of which include a form of battery. When I see the word domestic in front of one, I begin to sweat. I'd tried to block out how our relationship ended, to move on, but even with years of therapy, it was difficult, partly because I wasn't sure exactly what had happened. It took me decades of living 900 miles away to build up the courage to request copies of the court documents from my case. They arrived at my apartment in New York City, where I worked for a women's fashion brand. My days were spent reviewing photography layouts featuring stick-thin models in oversized minimalist garb, their eyes vacant. When I emptied the contents of the manila envelope onto my marble tabletop, some of what I found surprised me. The fact that the year we broke up, Jack had been charged a $100 domestic violence fine and then been processed through court collections for not paying it. Or that I still recognized the backward slant of his handwriting on one of the forms and could imagine the tip of his tongue sticking out through the side of his teeth as he carefully printed each tiny letter of his name. But mostly, I was surprised at the acts described in the charging documents. Thank you. Not sure who I hand it back to now.
I think we're doing questions now.
Questions. One has come through. You should be able to see it there in your feed.
Yes. So Mira asked, Sarah, I absolutely adore your writing. What are you working on and what's next?
I've written some other essays, but I'm working actually on a novel about a woman who's obsessed with elephants. So anyone who knows me will know that I am obsessed with elephants. So perhaps it is really just a fantasy memoir. I'm not sure, but it's something close to my heart and that I'd like to sort of get lost in as my next project.
I'm not surprised at all that you're working on fiction because it's like I don't know, I think your scenes and characters are just so memorable. I guess it's like, it's frustrating that it's always like, oh, well, you should write a novel, you know, like to nonfiction writers, but in a way it's like, yeah, it doesn't surprise me. I think it's going to be amazing.
I also think you need a break from personal essays. You know,
For
I could
sure.
write some critical and reported essays, but I think I need a break.
Definitely. So Arizona asked, does your obsession with elephants have an origin story?
Wow. It does. I think that it has to do with some motherhood issue and probably my relationship with my mother. When I was very small, I just loved how affectionate and loving the elephants were. And I just felt like my mother wasn't particularly affectionate. I mean, she was a lovely woman. It just wasn't her thing to be, you know, very comforting and nurturing in that way. So um, I think that's part of it. But I also think that when you, part of recovering from trauma at some stage is advocacy. So at this point in my life, I'm using my advocacy for animal rights, and in particular elephants, because they really speak to me as emotional and sentient, intelligent creatures.
I had gotten a question actually before that might speak to the same question, if you would describe your book as a how-to for healing.
Um, it's definitely not self-help. However, I think when you're writing about trauma and recovery, you have to show how you get from A to B, A being the place you were before and B being the place you are now. And I do think that a lot of what I did are things that could be helpful to someone else. I think the first step is naming what happened to you. I think that for a long time, I spent a lot of time thinking these things were minor, like an acquaintance rape or an abusive boyfriend, because that's kind of what society tells us they are. But when I requested those court documents and I saw actually this has a name and it's domestic battery. And I think by naming, you sort of take back some of the power and you're able to process this piece, this thing that happened to you, and you can then sort of take the steps forward. There are a lot of, like, I write a lot about therapy just because I personally think it's really interesting. I went to group therapy personally, and I've recommended it to other friends. I believe it's also worked for them. But then I also think everyone is unique. There's an essay in the book about my dog puppets. I have these two puppets. I would get them out, but I think it would be too weird. But just having these sort of quirky things that are specific to you. There's no one size fits all, but I think the idea that you can integrate these experiences into your life in a way that's totally normal because they're super common and a lot of us have experienced them. I think that is one thing that I was trying to say with my book, because I didn't see it in a lot of other books. They were either one long narrative about some terrible thing that happened, or there was the chapter about the rape or the chapter about the abusive boyfriend, but it wasn't like, okay, so what do I do with this? I didn't find that answer in books. So in a way, yes, I do think that's part of the reason I wrote the book. Whether I would follow any of my how to heal advice is a different question.
We have another question from Mercy Cannon. She says, Alice, I find Britney Spears an absolutely fascinating cultural subject object. Is there a current pop star that reminds you of her in the way that she was created, curated, shaped by music executives? Would Taylor Swift be the anti-Britney? I'm so interested.
I'm so interested too. I love to write about pop stars, and I've written actually quite a few pieces, especially earlier on in my career. I wrote about Taylor Swift, I wrote about Miley Cyrus, wrote about Lorde. And so I don't know, I actually think, I mean, like, You know, one time somebody said to Mariah Carey, like, oh, you know, everyone says that Ariana Grande is the young Mariah Carey. And she said, first of all, I'm still young. And I feel that way about Britney Spears too, a little bit. Like, well, she's still relevant. I mean, she's still making good music, and there's still lots going on with her, as we know, of the hashtag Free Britney movement. So in some ways, I feel like there's still more to say about Britney. Maybe I would revisit her someday, but I'm not sure nowadays. I've had this question before about whether there's like a current pop star who kind of is like particularly interesting or has like Britney resonance. But I feel like because it's like our pop landscape is so different, you know, I feel like top 40 radio is not as powerful, or MTV, and people find things through social media so much that things are more diverse, and even within age, body size, music type. Like if I think about like Billie Eilish and Ariana Grande and Lizzo, like those are all very different people in a way that I think is like, it couldn't be more different from the like several blondes who, you know, I was, you know, given as options to enjoy. So yeah, I don't know if that's an answer, but I love writing about pop music, so maybe it's just, you know, more writing to come. But yeah, thank you so much.
Great, thanks. We've got another one for Sarah from Logan. He says, I'd love to hear more about your process when writing an essay. How do you decide when to bring in reporting or outside sources?
I think it depends on the essay. I usually just sort of start with what's standing out to me in my memory, or if it's an idea, maybe it's something in culture that I'm writing about. I think that generally once you get something on the page, you start to see, oh, I'm actually reporting to avoid writing the personal story, or I'm writing a personal story that doesn't need to be in this reporting. So I think some of it is just being a writer and making connections, putting them on the page, looking at it, seeing if one is adding to the other, if they're adding up to more than the sum of their parts, and then sort of guiding it into the way that it's saying something by either guiding it towards the research and the criticism or the personal. Although Alice, being a teacher and an expert, might know more about this than me.
I don't. I'm sure I would say the same thing. It's like, try it out.
Yeah. See what it looks like.
Yeah, for sure.
We have another question from Lauren, who says, you both write a lot about deep-rooted and personal things, which in my experience has been hard as a writer. What is some advice you could both give for aspiring writers wanting to share their stories centered around hard words?
Sarah, you want to start?
Sure. I think writing the hard stuff is valuable. And I think that there's a lot of fear around publishing. What will people think if I put this out? What will my mother think? What will my grandmother think? What will my colleagues think? And I think that you just have to write with the blinders on and try not to worry about what anyone will think, because you don't have to do anything with it. But what you might learn from writing, you might discover a truth beneath the truth. And from there, it might lead you to write something else that you want to publish if you don't want to publish the piece that you wrote. But I do think that giving yourself time, you don't have to rush it, you don't have to publish it, you can just think about it until you're ready.
I think time is a huge part as well. Even I like to think that our experiences open up to us in meaning as we get older. And there are things that I've been through that when they were happening, I was like, my life is so boring. And then I look back on it and I'm like, oh, there was a lot going on there. You know, so there's a level where sometimes I think it is about letting something sit, you know, and not feeling pressure to write about something right away. But I'm really not a person who's that comfortable writing about personal things. I mean, and so and especially early in my career, I was like, I'm not interested in that. Like, I am just a critic or whatever. And to me, having another subject like Britney Spears that I could sort of also write about at the same time was a way to give myself freedom to write about my own experience. And also, I do want to say, like, there's something interesting about like in Sarah's piece that she read, what I would point out to my students is that she does this act of what I would call self-archiving, going back and doing research on your own experience. Well, what happened to me? Oh, there's a record here that I can find. I think in some ways, especially as women, and this is something I struggle with, I feel like I don't have authority on my own story. I don't feel like, you know, I know necessarily what happened, or maybe, oh, I'll say this, but somebody will disagree with me. Obviously, in some cases, you just have to push through that feeling. But I think there also are ways to use research as a way to have that confidence to tell your own story. To say, okay, well, let me go back and look at that email, or like, or talking to people who experience the thing at the same time. I think that's one way that I have found that makes it easier to write about things that are personal, is almost treating it like a research project.
This question is for Sarah from Delaney, who asks, did you have moments when you were writing your essays that you found you couldn't be as candid or truthful as you would like? And if so, how did you navigate that and find the words or ability to capture what happened and how you felt?
Yes, there's always things I left out. I tend to put as much in as I can because I really feel like my job as a memoirist writing personal essays is to tell the truth. And usually that's where the most interesting part is, and it's the most universal part, are the things that we can't speak, but we can write. Like, I couldn't call a friend and tell her what I wrote in a 5,000 word essay. So I think that at some point you have to decide. Usually I do this at the end, is I go through and cut out the parts that I decide either just aren't really that relevant, aren't adding anything, and that make me feel too exposed. I mean, it's never the whole story. It's one view, one strand, one angle to look at a story. But I mean, yeah, it's hard. It's part of the, if you want to write memoir, something that you have to be able to really look at yourself and decide what's serving your story, as much as just putting stuff in for sensationalism. Did that answer your question? I'm not.
You can always chime back in and ask a follow-up. I can get that to them too. Jonathan asks, did you write this particular essay that you read years ago? And how did you remember all of the details so vividly?
I have tried to write this essay actually for years, and I wasn't really able to. I think because I thought, this is a bad thing that happened, and what do I make of that? Like, I think when you write an essay or a memoir, there's an expected takeaway, or you're going to learn something from it. And really, what I learned, the story in that essay, is that, in fact, by requesting these documents, by looking into it deeper, I understood it better, and I was able to sort of move on because of that. As far as memories go, I always say I have a bad memory, and I write the things that really stick out to me. So there are certain things that I remember, and I use that to make a story. Like, there are certain details, like going to the prison, but also I didn't read the full essay, but requesting those documents definitely triggered my memory, because I remembered visuals after seeing, oh, this happened, that I had completely forgotten, in part because it was a traumatic experience. But I think that, yeah, anything, I mean, some people talk to people they know at the time. There are a lot of ways to research it. And it also just, that essay took a lot of time. I've been living with that experience for a while, and I finally decided that I wanted to reclaim it in the form of an essay with what I remembered, which I'm sure there's a whole book of things that I don't remember.
This question is for Alice. It's from a mother who's thinking about her 9-year-old daughter's fascination with Ariana Grande. And she says, what do you think about the possible negative effects of pop star fandom on girls?
Well, what do I think? It's hard to say because obviously it's like, I think that we, like, people in my generation anyway, like, I think that a lot of women have a lot of affection for Britney Spears because in a lot of ways, these bad forces that kind of gave her to us acted on us as well. And sort of we recognize her as sort of like a fellow victim of, you know, the patriarchy, essentially. And so I think there's a way in which you can think about young girls as not being dumb, not being oblivious to, you know, the ways that they're being judged or shaped or pressured. And so in some ways, I feel like I want to have some trust in kids, in the things that they like. And like, I listen to Ariana Grande, you know, like I think that there's some level of like, I like to not put too much pressure, I guess, on pop culture. I always tend to think of it, even like the idea of a dead girl show, which is a lot of what the first section of my book is about. I do find those documents disturbing, but it isn't, I'm not in favor of censorship. I don't think that we should then, you know, get rid of all the dead girl shows. I think that pop culture flows from cultural forces. I don't think it shapes those cultural forces necessarily. I think it's rare that it's reciprocal. I think more often it reflects what's happening in society. And so I always think, you know, focusing on making things more equitable, you know, focusing on education, these things that we know need to happen, making our culture less violent, that is going to be reflected in pop culture. So I think that young girls, you know, they're aware, they understand those contradictions, I think, a lot of the time. So I wouldn't be too worried about this fandom because there's bigger fish to fry, I guess, is kind of my real feeling about it. But I think that girls are smarter than we give them credit for.
I think we'll probably just have time for about 3 more questions, but I think this one's pretty universal from Chloe. She says, Alice, I also struggle with having authority over my story. How did you move past it?
Well, and Sarah, you should maybe answer this too, but I guess I think seeing myself as a character was a huge part of it for me. When I'm writing, even if I'm writing in the first person, I don't feel like myself, you know, I feel like a different, like more smart, more stylish, you know, more interesting version of myself. And even that shapes the way that I see my experiences too. And in some ways it is kind of a romanticizing of that experience, and maybe I want to reflect upon that reflection, you know, again. It's not exactly that I believe, you know, these in this version of myself, but I think that was hugely helpful, you know, trying to form a character who I could follow. That helped me to be with myself. Because that I think can be the hardest part, especially for writers. There's so much self-loathing in the act of writing. So being with yourself and writing about yourself can be just like sickening, you know, almost. So finding a way to like yourself, you know, that's huge. Maybe in general, but as a, you know, liking your writer persona.
We had a follow-up question for Sarah from Blue, who asks if, as you work to publish your book and other works, have you had any experiences in the publishing process where you felt you were negatively affected by being an outspoken woman?
Not in publishing, no. But I have found that most of the editors I've worked with have been women. So I don't really feel like it's had any kind of consequence. I am aware of, and I think Chanel Miller wrote really eloquently about this in her book. There's a new afterword where she talks about deciding to come out as a survivor of sexual assault, and being outspoken and what that meant for her. And while, yeah, you lose something because everyone who Googles you is going to find out that information, you also gain something. You contribute something to society. You reclaim your story. You have a voice in a cultural discussion that has been needing to happen for years and that has just sort of started in 2017 with the Me Too movement. So I personally haven't really been affected by it in the publishing world, unless there are men secretly rejecting me that I don't know about, which is possible, or women, but no.
And we had a specific question about your essay, Lovers, and how you decided to write it in the second person.
Lovers. So yes, that essay is a story about my sexual assault and how it affected my life, and particularly my sex life. I started it in the first person past tense, which is the normally how I write. And it was just like pulling teeth every sentence. I was like, this sounds so stupid. I hate it. And I just switched to second person, and it was like a waterfall. I wrote it in, like, I don't know, the fastest I've ever written any essay. It was like all of these feelings and thoughts that wanted to come out. And there is some distancing in second person where you feel like, this isn't me. I'm not saying I did this. I'm saying you find that this, you go here. And so I think there is some distancing, but then I think the craft work that had to be done after that was I redid whole passages in first person to see what I thought. And I decided that actually for that essay, second person, which a lot of people hate it, and it doesn't work all the time, it felt like the right point of view, in part because that essay talks about multiple selves in a way that is kind of unusual. So I'm meeting my earlier self and talking about my earlier self. So it kind of makes sense to use you and she as opposed to I and she. Anyway, it basically, the story usually decides for you, is the short answer.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much. We do have a few questions that didn't get asked or were repeated from other questions. And so I would just, can you all let everybody know where to follow you on social media or your website presences so that they can find you later if they want to ask you directly?
Sure. You can Google me, Sarah Kasbeer, and find my website where my email is. And I get a lot of weird emails from Chinese suppliers because I posted my email address there. So feel free to email me. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram under my regular name.
I'm on Twitter and Instagram too, just at Alice Bolin. So very easy.
I have posted the link to Zone 3 Press where you can purchase both books, those of you who are interested. Thank you all so much for coming. It was a really fun night and I appreciate it very much.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much
y'all.
for having us.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Alice.